I think we've got, okay, that's official. When we hear that recording in progress, that's official. So welcome everyone. My name is Larry Ragan. I'm the facilitator of today's program. And I've met many of you through the Maryland Online Leadership Institute, Online Learning Leadership Institute, MOLLI, over the last several years. And it's been my pleasure to work with the MOL staff and great colleagues over the years. So this has been a wonderful community to participate in. And I hope you're finding the same thing. I think having this kind of a network where we can reach out, connect to each other, and kind of work on topics that are important to us, in particular in the online learning domain, but always with a lens on leadership. And that's what we're going to do today. So our topic today is debunking the myths of professionalism. And a quick backstory on this topic. We've done several topics over the last few years in webinar format, and they've been well received and great conversations and all good stuff. And as we were talking about a topic for the fall, we said, you know, let's go a little bit lighter for the fall. Everybody's hearing all kind of heavy stuff on this and that. Let's pick a topic that maybe is a little bit more fun, if you will. That might be a strong term, but, you know, a little lighter. And so I drafted up some information and sent it out to a small group. We have an advisory group. And one of our colleagues, she's with us today, Megan Myers, wrote back and said, well, you know, I think this is a bit light. And this topic really has changed over the years and really deserves a deeper dive. And that's how we sort of revisited. We had several conversations. Megan helped me draft the abstract, and we came up with what I think is a more thoughtful, deeper look at this issue of professionalism. So it started out light, not that it's going to be dark. It's just going to be hopefully thought-provoking, informative, and I said, you know, maybe a little challenging at points. So we've got three great panelists, and I'm so pleased to have them with us today. I'm going to let them do their formal introductions or formal titles, but let me just mention Megan Myers, Clayton, Steen, and Emily Tipton. And Megan, you're on the top of my list there. Would you want to go ahead and introduce yourself?
Sure. So I'm Megan Myers. I'm the Interim Associate Vice President for Faculty Development and Learning Innovation at Howard Community College. And I was in the very first MOLLI class that ever existed. So I'm a MOLLI alum, like some of you all here. And I will say that my connection to the topic of professionalism is that, you know, it's something that we are thinking about and talking about in our world at Howard Community College. What does it mean, right, to be a professional, and how can we broaden maybe some of the traditional ways that we have thought of that, and really focus on competence and have a competency-based approach to that, to make sure that we're as inclusive as possible for our, our team as we build out our team. And then also when I work with faculty, you know, really thinking about professionalism from the point of view of students. And sometimes that professionalism can be used in a exclusive way as opposed to an inclusive way. And so in terms of faculty development, that's definitely some, a series of conversations that I have been in faculty over the last couple of years. So that is, my background a little bit, and how I am connected to the topic of professionalism.
Good. Thank you, Megan. I'm going to come back to you with some questions that will unpeel that onion just a little bit. Unpeel, I'm not sure that's the correct word, but peel back that onion. Clayton, let's go to you next. A little introduction, please.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining. Thank you, Larry. My name is Clayton Steen. I am the Associate Vice President for Enrollment Management Services for the Penn State World Campus. And I actually have a bit of first of all, I have an emerging relationship with MOLLI. This is really my first semester working with MOLLI, and I'm really pleased to join you. My situation is a little different with regards to leadership. And what I mean by that is our World Campus. I'm not sure if you're familiar with the Penn State system. The World Campus is our online delivery campus. And with that, we are now kind of being looked upon by the rest of the system, the remaining 26 campuses, to really kind of redefine and reshape what professionalism is from the online perspective. We were actually on campus as well, located right in State College in the Innovation Park. But the pandemic really allowed us to transition to being almost exclusively fully remote. And what I mean by almost exclusively, there are some aspects of World Campus Online Education that kind of shared a dual relationship with the remaining Central State College campuses as well, the other campuses. So they still report. But my offices in particular, we have transitioned to exclusively remote. And having been sort of hybrid remote prior, we're kind of looked at as now the model as to how to maintain professionalism. So some of these conversations that I'm sure many of you are having in your own workplace, one example that comes to mind is whether or not our cameras should be on. And interestingly enough, most of our cameras aren't on. And so they're looking at us for that. They've looked at us for a one-stop shop model where we're allowing our students to engage with our campus through areas of student affairs where you would expect that to be in person, as well as many of the administrative needs that they have remotely and online. So that's really hopefully what I bring to today's discussion. And I look forward to chatting with all of you.
Thank you, Clayton. That's a great intro and helps us at least frame a little bit of this conversation around the online learning space, because that's going to be another factor, if you will, in the conversation. Let me go to Emily. Would you like to say hello and introduce yourself, please?
Yes, good morning, everyone. My name is Emily Tipton. I am currently the Research and Assessment Analyst at Chesapeake College, where I started in spring of this year. I'm not in a leadership role, but I think the context of my input here today is from my previous 10 years in career services in higher ed institutions. So I worked at a handful of four-year state institutions along the East Coast, working with employers to get industry-specific knowledge about what each industry sees as professionalism, what their hiring expectations are, what their practices are when it comes to hiring, and then subsequently advising students on here's what employers are saying. But I think in career services, what a lot of opportunity lies in the intersection of being able to educate not just students, but employers on here are what students' expectations are and the evolving values of Gen Z. You kind of have the opportunity to speak with both populations about professionalism in the context of many different industries and graduate programs and wherever anyone finds themselves.
Good, thank you, Emily. That's really interesting, and you certainly have an interesting perspective to say how has this evolved over time, you know, having worked with those students and those employers and having gone through the pandemic. I'm sure there's a lot of change in that as well. So we'll come back to that topic. So just by way of context, quickly, you know, the word professionalism has been used, connected to leadership forever. And I think in many ways has been sort of defined by the ruling class, the power class, if you will, whoever that might have been about, you know, and it addressed things like the, you know, the color of your suit and the tie you wear, whether you wear a tie or not, but also extended into some behaviors that were Megan mentioned the word sort of restrictive or exclusive. I can remember very early on in my career with Penn State, which turned out to be 34 years, of this very stiff protocol in conversations and in meetings who's allowed to speak, when they're allowed to speak, and so forth. And it was considered sort of professional. You don't speak out of turn. You don't offer a counter idea to someone else's unless you've had a private conversation. You know, these kinds of almost odd now when I look back at it. I was like, that's kind of interesting behavior that we were cultured in. You know, and this is what Megan Myers' really driving point was when we had this conversation several months ago. She said, you know, so much of this has changed. And it's been changing in a good way because we're pushing back and challenging some of these concepts about what defines a professional in today's environment. And that really, really got me thinking. And I really came to sort of embrace this idea of change. And this is what I really wanted to explore. So Megan, if you don't mind picking up on that thought and share with us a little bit about the definition of professionalism. I know it gets a little, you know, murky. There are lots of different definitions out there, but how would you frame this term professionalism for us?
Yeah, so there are definitely components about professionalism and the way that it's been used, I think, over the past 50 years that make me right, like super nervous, because I think that it has been used in an exclusive way, right? It's been used to keep people out of places, and that can be in our institutions, and that can also be our students. And so I want us to be really mindful of that, right? And that can be based on all different types of things, right? And I think many of us think back, I know at my very first job, there was 3 approved hairstyles, right, that women can wear, right? And so those kinds of things have a lot of, there's gender, there's race, there's a lot of baggage that comes with that. And that is saying you can't be your authentic self at work, right? And one thing that I think is really valuable for both individuals, but also for institutions, is when people can be their authentic self at work. People can be who they are, they can be comfortable, right? And they can contribute. And people are going to be the most productive versions of themselves, right? When they have that level of comfort. And really, as a supervisor, as a leader, the thing that I'm looking for is, is my team, right? Are they able to do their jobs, right? And what does that mean? That doesn't mean a particular way that people are dressing. And maybe, people have thought about professionalism in the past. It's really those competencies, right? So I don't care if somebody wears a suit or a t-shirt. I care that we're meeting our students where we're supposed to be meeting them, that what are the core functions of our job? Okay, let's be able to do those things. And then if not, let's work together to be able to get there. I think that we have to think about professionalism and authenticity together and be able to allow people to their own authentic professionals, right? To be able to be both things at the same time. And so that's kind of my pushback on the idea of professionalism, that we should bring it, into our current world and really think of it in a way of being inclusive, right? And allowing people to be authentic. And I don't just for employees, I think it benefits institutions as well.
Thank you, Megan. It strikes me that one of the features of this evolving term, excuse me, is you use that term authentic a couple of times, allowing people, individuals, to be individuals and not to have to conform to these predefined structures of how one looks or behaves and so forth. Clayton, let me go to you next. Any thoughts on that? Reflections on Megan's definition there?
Well, Larry, when we first met and you introduced this topic and you introduced this question, I really struggled with this one because in the context to which you introduced it, you spoke to it more so as an external demonstration of professionalism. But I struggled because I couldn't reconcile my internal views on professionalism. So I really had to kind of put together a couple of notes for this topic because I'm like, how am I going to respond? And really, The reconciliation or challenge that I have is I kind of look at this in three separate ways. Professionalism for me really falls under my professionalism as an administrator in higher education and adjunct professor. But then I also have, in a competing way, is me as an African-American male working in a predominantly white, often female-dominated industry like higher education. And then last but not least, the reconciliation of me being a social scientist by practice and really focusing on that social and cultural justice and awareness. And how do I reconcile all of those three into professionalism? And I recognize that with the administrator role, I'm more often than not trying to promote social cohesion, inquiry, discovery, entertainment for all. So I'm really focused on how I could be as integrative as possible in my approach. And then I take that opposite approach, maybe even 5 minutes later, being an African-American male and really kind of looking at myself as being responsible for being as interactive as possible to really overcome and remove barriers and stereotypes of African-American males being confrontational or not approachable and things of that nature. So now I'm actually feeling kind of the opposite and really looking to be as interactive as possible. And then last but not least, that social, that social justice component that's really near and dear to my heart. I find myself doing the exact opposite, predominantly focusing on leading Black male student initiatives or speaking mostly for minority programs in the trio areas of the university and looking to speak to people that look like and represent myself. And then when I take on mentors for doctoral students, I find that more often than not, the majority of them are African-American and in many cases males. So I kind of see myself looking at leadership and saying, how do I reconcile that? So that's really kind of, I can honestly, I still don't have that answer, but I can say that leadership takes on a different perspective for me in all three categories, and it's very different and sometimes conflicting.
Yeah, well, I appreciate your honesty, Clayton, because I think as we've had internal conversations as well, we've also recognized the sort of the baggage of the term, the need for it to evolve, and the fact that maybe we haven't arrived, and maybe we never will, at a single proper definition of professionalism. And maybe that's in today's conversation, maybe that's what we sort of help each other do, is to push for that definition and maybe where some of those boundaries are. Emily, I wanted to just on this particular topic, see if you had anything to add to that. Your lens was, again, a slightly different perspective, which I think was very valuable for us.
Yeah, well, and I'll be pretty brief. I think because I'm not in a leadership role, I'm always looking internally at my own definition. If I'm comparing myself to a supervisor's definition or somebody else on my team, thinking about professionalism and comparing myself against someone else, thinking about what has influenced my definitions, where is bias coming in, where did I get these different definitions that I have of professionalism from throughout my life, from whom are they informed? And even just checking in now, I look at Megan and Clayton and I think, wow, they've presented themselves really professionally and I have not. But I am also navigating a new identity and thinking about how identities and professionalism intersect, because I am coming up on 7 months pregnant. I literally don't fit into any of my business suits. I cannot barely lift my hands above my head to do my hair. I can't put on makeup, and it's really challenging my lens of how I present myself when it's like I walk by a mirror and my pants are falling off my body. It's like, oh, I'm really doing my best here. But I think thinking about, that's just a small example of how identity and identities that you navigate influence the culture of a workplace and an environment you're in, and also how you feel influenced by them and impacted by them.
But Emily, I have to tell you something. I just was reading an article I think it was in Forbes on this topic, and the author spoke to the point that today, in today's environment, she has no problem saying or expressing, yeah, I've got 2 children, I'm expecting a third. Whereas years ago, we would kind of keep that out of the conversation. You weren't allowed to talk. It's not that you weren't allowed to talk about it, but it was not supposed to influence. And I think what you just illustrated was this fact that professionalism, authenticity, if you will, is about being the individual and embracing that. Clayton spoke to that as well in saying, this is who I am, and I'm figuring it out. And the rest of us, I think in so many ways, the rest of us look at that inside, like, oh, thank goodness. Okay, it's a human being. They also have issues. They have parent issues. They've got children issues. You know, this is life. And maybe this new environment is allowing us a bit to bring that to the forefront. So I really appreciate that. Clayton, I wanted to go to you next and talk about this. I'm looking for the linkage between professionalism and leadership, and how the two are joined. And I have a thought, if you don't mind. I just want to share a real quick thought as it came out of this conversation about the fact that professionalism is not tied to a individual leadership position.
Oh, it isn't. That's a very good point. It's not tied to a leadership position. It's really, I kind of look at those 2 words and say the connection is really found in the root of the 2 words, professional and leader. And I consider a professional being really kind of what you practice, while being a leader is who you are. Mm-hmm. And you will find yourself even in roles where you're looking, when you are looked to be a follower or contributor, still being a leader by how you follow and how you contribute. Mm-hmm. So I find that to be where the connection is. Professionalism in my community, it promotes things that you typically don't find in corporate America. It's a little more casual. We promote intellectual and analytical thought and trying to be creative. Not to say that you don't find that in corporate America, but that's really something that's highly valued in higher education. So so your professionalism practices and traits in this community, in this environment, is not necessarily readily transferable in the others. So again, that's something that you have to practice, and you'll find that as you come to a community, one community versus the other, that you're going to see some differences in how professionalism is promoted. Another example that comes to mind, at my current institution, we refer to each other by our first names, Clayton, Larry, etc. Other institutions to which I've worked, it's VP Steen or Dr. Steen, etc.
Really?
And yeah, many of the institutions to which I've worked for in the past, that would be the titles that we would refer to each other by. And it's interesting because we would struggle with the fact that sometimes people might not know that you've earned your doctorate and therefore call you Mr. Steen, and some of that uncomfortableness that was created from that environment. You don't have that in corporate America more often than not. So people aren't necessarily referring to titles. So something as simple as that is a professionalism in practice. Whereas leadership, again, I say that's transferable no matter what industry that you're in. And it really is about having things such as emotional intelligence, your directiveness, integrity, dedication, these values. As long as you have those values, they're transferable from a leadership perspective, at least in my opinion, no matter what institution that you're a part of, and really organizations as well. It doesn't even have to be in the workplace. It could be in things that you do outside of work as well.
Mm-hmm. So it's more of the manner of how one conducts themselves. And I like the point you made about whether you're a follower or a leader, whether you have the title or not, professionalism still applies.
Yes.
I like that. Megan, Emily, any follow-up thoughts or comments to that?
Yeah, I think that I really love Clayton's point. I think that there's just lots of ways to be a professional, right? That we maybe wouldn't have seen in the past, right? So I'll give an example of like employees having tattoos, right? I think that in the past that would have sometimes, like if you would have shown your tattoos at work, that would have been seen as unprofessional. And I don't think that that's the case anymore. I think, again, kind of going back to that like authenticity piece, that is a way that a person can be authentic, still wear, dress that's appropriate to their role, but like be who they are, right? Whether, and again, regardless of their position. And I think that that's really important, right? I think it's really important in also allowing people, for leaders to model that, so that other people can feel comfortable in their own positions as well, right? So I think if leaders are modeling that kind of comfort, modeling, okay, I can be vulnerable, I can be who I am, right? That's going to allow other people at the institution to also feel like, okay, be who I want to be too, right? It's okay to be myself in my position.
Good, thanks, Megan. Emily, any thoughts?
I think just from and I'll get into this later with a later question I think you're going to prompt, but just that students, and when I say students, I mean anyone pursuing higher ed right now, whether at the graduate level or undergraduate level, are being encouraged to kind of be more self-aware, and not just in colleges and universities, but by their parents, families. It's just a new generational shift of encouraging self-awareness of your own values and in what kind of work environment you want to be working in. And I think you'll find that a lot of students right now, people pursuing education, are more drawn to environments that, like Clayton proposed, where they can be more authentic and they don't have to fit into a box that they see as very antiquated, and that I personally see as very antiquated in a lot of ways. But I think that as just the shifts of generations mean that the definitions of professionalism have to be fluid, they have to be adaptable. And I think you'll find that the new incoming workforce populations, they're looking for that. They're demanding it, which I know for a lot of people is a lot different than what I know. I graduated college during the recession, and it was just that you were lucky to have a job. So, and that was just 15 years ago. So a lot can change very quickly. And I think when it comes to the definition of professionalism, leaders need to look around the room, think about how they're defining professionalism, why they are, who's in the room with them. Yeah.
So, this topic, I'm going to go off script a little bit here, team. This topic raises a question. Megan, you mentioned tattoos and such, and I'm going to take it to a safer place, maybe t-shirts, right? And slogans on t-shirts. There are still boundaries, socially accepted boundaries that we have to adhere to. I guess they would be considered sort of in the realm of being a professional, but I cannot wear, so let's say my workplace says, yeah, we're going to have casual Fridays, wear a t-shirt, a school spirit shirt if you want, and, jeans, whatever. I still have a boundary on the appropriateness of what I select to wear. I can't come in with an offensive, I don't know, Megan, you're smiling, so I'm curious as to what you're thinking.
I think I'm remembering a conversation that we've already had before, which is really about, what should supervisors or institutions enforce? And I know this is like, I always go back to this, institutions should enforce their policies, right? But if it isn't written down, I don't think that supervisors should be having conversations with their employees about what they wear or their hair or anything else, right? Because that is not, again, that's not appropriate, right? So for me, like we're getting into a different conversation about, the inclusion and really being exclusive. So if the institution has a policy which says, we want to make sure that no one wears anything that, that no one says or wears or represents anything that could be crude or lewd or and has that outline, then great, right? That's outlined, and that's an appropriate conversation for someone to have, you know, if that person wore a shirt that would violate that policy. But really, that's where I kind of always go back to, which is institutions have to think about who they are, right? Our core values, and their policies should reflect their core values. And then that's where people can have conversations, is around those policies, and not just around, well, you know, when I was coming up, this is what, you know, I was told to wear, because I was told to do all kinds of things, right? That were not, you know, what I would say are the values that I would want of an institution now. So I think we have to really think critically about, you know, what are the institutions that we want to create? We are helping, right? As leaders, and whether or not you formally have that leader role, right? If you're in this room with us, you are a leader, right? We are helping to create these institutions now. So we have to think about, what institution do we want to create, and is it holding those values? So that's kind of where I go to look at our values. Do our policies reflect those values? Then enforce the policy. If it's not in the policy, then do we need a policy? If not, let's not talk about it.
Yeah. Megan, I appreciate your repeating that, and I appreciated it when you shared it in the beginning, because it you know, codifying it, putting it in print, gives me something to point to. It takes away the arbitrary decision of, oh, I don't like that comment on your shirt, or oh, you're supporting this team and not that. It takes that away, and I think that is such a sound practice, and it is a leadership practice, right? It also gives, to me, it strikes me as it gives a prospective employee something to look at and say, well, what do you value? What are your, where is there room here for movement on the kinds of things I'm allowed to express and not? Emily, you were, you know, facing the students. Did you provide guidance along those terms about sort of the culture of the organization and an individual's culture or beliefs?
Yeah, and my eyes will be darting to the left because I'm going to be referencing research here and some specific quotes. I don't want to mess up, but a big driving force in career services and higher ed is these ideas of career competencies. So the National Association of Colleges and Employers is a governing body that I think a lot of career services units look to. It's higher ed professionals coming together with employers and HR professionals from a breadth of industries to define competencies, and then research employers on what they define or see as the most critical. So in 2015, professionalism was number one. It was the number one sought after competency that 97% of employers ranked as critical, or essential. And the definition back then was very concrete. It was, I'll read it here. The individual demonstrates integrity, ethical behavior, acts responsibly with the interests of the larger community in mind, will be able to learn from their mistakes, demonstrate personal accountability and effective work habits, including punctuality and understanding the impact of nonverbal communication and professional work image. So a lot of room for individual interpretation, and that was just in 2015. By 2022, they had redefined professionalism. It had also fallen to number 5 on the list of competencies that employers are most seeking from recent graduates of institutions. And now it ranks behind critical thinking, communication, teamwork, and equity and inclusion. And so we talk to students a lot about this shift. You know, we use this definition, or NACE and the research group behind NACE defined this for employers when asking them, how do you rank these competencies? And then we take that definition to students. So showing students that this used to be a really concrete definition just 7 years ago. And now post-pandemic, the group itself acknowledged professionalism is hard to define. Even between the 13 of us that sit on this research group, we want to acknowledge that traditional definitions are rooted in whiteness, can be used as an avenue to discriminate. that critique rests on the idea that standards of professionalism serve as a coded language that favors the culture and values of white and Western employees. And so now they've kind of redefined it as more of a construct. They don't give it a specific definition that could later become problematic. And I think back to the 2015 definition of the impact of nonverbal communication on professional work image and how ambiguous that is and how up to even personal interpretation that is. And so now it's more of a construct. They give sample behaviors. They define professionalism as knowing work environments differ greatly. So that's something we're telling students, that you want to know what the work environment is that you're going into, and it's going to differ at the industry level, at the company or organization level, and even at the personnel level. You might have a supervisor of one unit having different definitions of expectations than a supervisor of another. So with that, we are empowering students, and I think they're doing this among themselves too. It's not just career services professionals. And I just saw the question. Yeah, I can share this article about the research, all the competencies, the definitions, and the validity and design of the research. They've been doing it for the past 7 years. I think 2015 was the first time they did this. But you see us using that definition to talk to students about defining their own skills and interests and values, and feeling empowered in interviews and in researching a company's website to ask questions. And I think if you're teaching the students to define for themselves what their skills are, what their interests are, and what their values are, then they're going to give more authentic representations of themselves in the interview, in their resume and cover letter, in a networking environment. And it's just going to provide a better match for everyone. But we're also advising students two things. Number one, when you're in an employer, you can be asking them questions to evaluate whether or not a position or a company, organization, whatever, is a good fit for you. Questions like asking them to define rules around professional expectations in the work environment, asking a supervisor, how do you foster an environment where people who come from different backgrounds and identities feel valued? What role does a good manager play in his or her relationship with reporting staff members? I've got a slew of questions I can copy in the chat, but you know, I think oftenly about how I would answer these questions, and I would implore people in the group today to think too about how they would answer these questions if a prospective candidate that they were really interested in asked them these questions, because I think it's really important. And I'm quoting two women from College Code, Chelsea Williams and Michaela Young, who said, it's important to help students understand that there will be instances in the workplace when professionalism and authenticity intersect and can potentially be at odds. So making sure that, I keep saying students, but it's anyone that's going into any job search or graduate school search, is thinking about themselves authentically and looking to prospective employers or graduate programs or whatever and saying, is this really going to be a good fit somewhere where I can be myself and be authentic and feel respected, valued, and have just the safe space to do my work to the best of my abilities.
Well, that's so it's a lot of material you just provided, a lot of thought.
Yeah, I'll copy. I'll post 3 articles, 3 links that I think cover a lot of what I just talked about.
Yeah, thank you, Emily. Thank you. Clayton, I know you're relatively new to Penn State, and I, of course, don't want you to say, anything you're not comfortable with, but I'm curious, as you came in, African-American male, into predominantly Center County here in center of Pennsylvania is a white community. I mean, predominantly. How did you make this assessment about the fit for you in this job?
Well, it's interesting that you share that. I serve on a committee where we are looking at how we can attract more non-whites, and we're actually we want to aggressively use the term non-whites instead of people of color, because what we're recognizing is, instead of it trying to instead of just trying to group them all into certain categories, how can we recruit more? So sharing information about churches and barbershops and restaurants and things of that nature is something that we just didn't consider. How can we connect them to the community? Because our biggest challenge, at least this is what was shared with me upon arrival, is that not so much how can we attract you, but how can we keep you? How can we keep you here and reduce the amount of turnover? I personally have struggled with it. There's some things that are kind of refreshing about being in Center County, but there's other things that really kind of still startle me. I make a right instead of a left, and I see a farm with cows. Milk is still being delivered to people's homes in the little milk tray. So those are some of the things to which I'm still adjusting to. But then you make the right turn and you're in, downtown and the city area and things of that nature. So it's still a transition. And I wouldn't necessarily say I feel uncomfortable as much as I have to be as open-minded as possible for the very practices to which is promoted highly in higher ed, which is looking at diversity in a way that you didn't look at it before. Even diversity in terms of what is a predominant culture diversity still has opportunities for you to participate and be active. And it's still, again, it's a growing process, but I've enjoyed it thus far.
Yeah. So this conversation is leading me to think of a few different questions. So my panelist, I sort of promised a bit of a script, but again, I'm going to kind of diverge just a little bit because I just find this so fascinating. I'm wondering what your responsibility, and I'm just going to speak to our three panelists today. What is your responsibility as a leader? And I know you may not have a leadership title, but you're thought leaders. What's your responsibility for working with a senior administrator who maybe hasn't made this shift in terms of how they see professionalism? Do you know what I'm saying? Do you know what I'm asking? So think of me. I'm the director, the vice president of such and such, and you're now, on the staff, but I have this mental image of how you should sort of look and when you should speak and so forth. What's your responsibility for helping to change that and influence some of that? Megan, I'll start with you.
Yeah, Larry, you can tell I just have a big mouth, right? And so that can be good or bad depending on the circumstance. But what I try to do is to handle those kind of situations really gently, but to also, address them, right? So not to let them be. And so in that kind of situation, I might send an email to somebody and say, hey, I don't know if you noticed, but, something that I have observed is XYZ. Here's some recent research about this. I understand that, that this might be contrary to your experience, but I would love to talk to you more about this, engage in a dialogue, and just to try to open that conversation, right? And sometimes people are really willing to engage in that conversation, and sometimes people are really taken aback and they don't want to. But I think it is our responsibility to engage in those conversations, but in a way that people are going to be open to it, which is probably not like in a Zoom meeting of 50 people to say you, right? I don't, so to kind of balance those two things, I think is really important. And I want to kind of highlight what Brooke is saying in our chat, which is, talking about how the fact that professionalism was so valued by institutions as recently as 2015 shows that we have a lot of work to do in making our workplaces inclusive places to be. I think that, that is one of the reasons you can see the Great Resignation, right? People are not as willing after COVID, after everything that everyone has been through, right? As willing to stay in institutions that they don't feel allow them to be their authentic self, right? And so I do think that it is of, just paramount importance for institutions to really do the work to make themselves inclusive. And that means, that policy work that I talked about before, but it also means that, that peer-to-peer work for individuals.
Thanks, Megan. Clayton, I'm going to come to you next, but I just want to kind of share a perspective as someone told me the other day, I'm not senior, I'm not middle-aged anymore. I've shifted a bit. My thinking is that for the first time, Megan, this actually happened with you and I as we were having this conversation. The first time I had to consider this, it was a bit of a slap in the face. I was kind of like, whoa. So I'm just wondering in terms of, and then it took a discussion, an honest discussion of, I didn't think of it that way. And I'm just imagining that in our workplaces, we have individuals who are sort of stuck on a definition of professionalism that's 20, 30, who knows how do we help change that? Clayton, how do you help change that?
Well, it's not easy. The institutions have become far more enlightened, and they've made progress, but they're not progressive yet. So there's really still much more that can be done. Megan, you mentioned earlier the ability to have tattoos in the workplace. That conversation shifts a bit when the tattoo is visible, even with your attire, if it's on your hands or neck or other places, or if you have piercings. That conversation shifts a bit. And it doesn't necessarily shift, and this is what I say about us being more enlightened, it doesn't necessarily shift in terms of us hiring them. It shifts when the opportunity for promotions and projects to which we would assign them to comes into play. One of the things that comes to mind with the new online environment is it's exponentially more difficult really to represent yourself appropriately. So you have to focus on really just this area now, and being dressed appropriately now takes on a different spin. We're in meetings where the camera looks exactly like it looks in this presentation with 15, 20 plus people in that meeting, and you're not sure of their level always. So you're very concerned. And to go back to your original question, I find myself having more offline conversations just because I don't know who's in the room. And I find myself making sure that I have my background on, and if in doubt, I'll still dress professionally rather than risk looking too casual and inappropriate or feeling like it's inappropriate. So there's still some of that professionalism struggle that exists. It could be in my mind, but I think that's really kind of how things still are. It's evolving, but things are still a bit challenging. So to your point, Larry, your question, you don't necessarily know how to fully engage, considering the limited avenues to which you can engage. Even when you are not in that meeting, you're engaging with them typically online somewhere, via a email or direct chat. And so you have to be mindful of the language you use, but you have to be succinct and get to the point. You can't kind of use your personality and the other things that might come into play with building a relationship with your superiors to make them feel more comfortable and understanding that you can code switch and shift and adjust. So it's challenging, but it happens. It's happening. Yeah. And the last thing I want to mention, we've got the Great Resignation. It's now followed by the silent quitting, which is even more difficult in terms of leadership and professionalism, because now we have people that refuse to engage, but they're still employed with you. And how do we get them constructively to be a part of this is also a huge challenge for us as leaders.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Clayton. Emily, you're on the end of gathering information and researching topics like this. How do you take that and, plow it back into the culture of the institution in ways that it's going to lead to, change?
Yeah, and I think um, prior to my assessment and research role here, which serves the entire college, I worked in research and assessment just within career services. So everything I did was focused on assessing student needs, but also assessing employer needs, and then using both of those to educate each other. So I think within that, I got to use that as kind of a curriculum for colleagues. And I think of a specific example where we had a, I think it takes the responsibility off my shoulders to say, well, employers are saying this, or students are saying they need this. And, that's the conflict avoidance in me. But, but I think to a specific, we were hosting at a previous institution, a speed networking competition where students were, based on a rubric that we would create, judged by employers, assessed using this rubric, in kind of a speed dating round robin style. And there was a monetary, they would win money if they won. So it mattered that the assessment tool we used was equitable. And so I had a colleague who was running the event who made the tool herself, and then I would critique it and give her feedback on how to make it equitable. And this was an in-person event. The very first line of the rubric was, professional image right off the bat. So did you stand up, shake an employer's hand, and make eye contact? And I said, if we have a student in a wheelchair right off the bat, can they stand up? If we have a student with autism who struggles with eye contact right off the bat, where are you setting them up? If we have a student that for religious reasons cannot make contact with somebody else, does not shake hands, they professionally address that whenever they come to our office when they're with an employer. How are you then presenting our office saying, this is how we define professionalism? To employers, we're sending that message, and to students, we're sending that message that right off the bat, this is not an inclusive event. If you fall under any of these identities, you're not going to win the competition. You're not a professional in our eyes. Yes, you're not welcome. This is not a safe space for you. So I think it's using student input, using research, using employer feedback, and career services is, I think, in a really great, I encourage everyone here to work with their career services offices to get their input, but also use what you learn to influence how they're advising students, and use it to influence how faculty are working with students, because students get a lot of feedback on professionalism from faculty. And so I think career services offices are also trying to go out to faculty and teach them these concepts and the evolution of everything going on, because students are getting a lot of input from a lot of different places right now. And everyone has different definitions of professionalism. So they're hearing a lot of different competing messages. So I think I would always defer to equity and assessment. It's a safe space for me. So I feel confident referring to it. There's plenty of research and articles about it that I can reference, to say, listen, I had to educate myself on this, and now it's time for our entire office to be educating ourselves and think about what message we're sending when we're creating tools like this that are going out to a number of stakeholders.
Thank you. I know, Megan, you're gonna add something to that, which is great. I'm just thinking to myself of the challenge of changing behavior in people. That's a tough one. Megan?
Yeah, no, I just wanted to hop in on the faculty piece, which is, I think we do see a lot of faculty policies, and this is, my work to a great extent around, late penalties and things like that, which when we talk about it with, faculty, they're like, well, at work, professionalism, people would be penalized for turning things in late. But I know, working with the same faculty, that all the time we turn things in late to one another, right? And things go, right? And we try not to, we do our very best, but people get sick, colleagues have people out of the office and can't get information back, and it just slows things down. And so we understand, right? We understand, we give each other grace, and then, you know, we send a little gentle reminder, right? I need this from you, get it back to me. And as long as we are able, as you know, as a unit, to meet whatever we need to meet, it doesn't derail us from, you know, our mission, our goal. And that's the same, you know, approach that I urge us to think about with students, which is, are the students meeting the objectives of the course, right? And if our penalties, our ideas around professionalism are going to dock so many points that the student is really damaged by that, even though they're meeting the course objectives, I want to challenge us to think about that. I want to challenge us to think about that, because our grades should be communicating to our future employers, right, what our students are able to do as far as performing, right, those core competencies, right, the course objectives. And, you know, if a student turned in a paper 3 days late, right, does that change their core performance from an A to a C, right, or not? And so in a world where we are thinking about more inclusive, giving people more grace, and helping our students make it to complete their degree, right, that's something that's a conversation I'm engaged in often with our faculty.
Yeah, I think those are great points. I hesitate to say this, but I'm going to throw it out there anyways. It seems to me the pandemic forced us, let's go back 3 years ago when things really started to cook, if you will, in that environment. We saw this all coming and started to react. We had, one of the things I remember hearing very, very early on was to faculty in particular, but maybe to leaders as well, as back off, like let your students emerge into this new environment, cut them a break, give them some slack. And I don't know, was that just me, or was that humanization of the experience part of what we kind of all experienced through the pandemic?
I think that, something that we really talked about is that showing grace, that showing, understanding students, that maybe our initial stance to students should not be a stance of suspicion, but a stance of and welcomeness and understanding. And you know what happened when we all did that? Nothing broke. Nothing.
Yeah.
Right? Like students did well, like, we all got it. And so, it would happen if we all kept that stance, right? That had the stance of, okay, a student is trying to trick me, a student is trying to get one over on me.
Yeah.
We really reframed our attitudes to like, okay, the student needs a bit more time. Fundamentally, there's certain checkpoints in my class, either they're going to make it or not going to make it. I'm going to do my best to help them make it, right? But that's this isn't a negative relationship between me and them where they can try to trick me or get like the relationship we're having a relationship where, right, I'm trying to help them get what they need, and I'm going to do my best to make that happen. We're creating that relationship based on trust and a positive relationship, not based on suspicion.
Not based on adversarial roles, right? Like, I mean, I still hear it from time to time, and it always makes me kind of cringe a little bit when I hear like, I'm going to get them, or they're not going to get one over on me. Hey, I want to make a shift. This is going to be kind of a pretty hard pivot, but I'm watching our time carefully here. There's a lot of focus today on this issue of diversity and equity and inclusion. And I shared with Clayton, I'd like to unwrap this a little bit in terms of how it also relates to professionalism, of the expectations, of the behaviors, of policy, and so forth. So I sort of want to start with Clayton, if I can, on this topic. Can you share a little bit with us about this relationship between DEI and in the workplace professionalism? How does it play out for you? How has it played out for you? And what do we need to be thinking about in terms of maybe redefining some of those expectations? Clayton, I think you're still on mute.
I apologize. I hit the
That's
mute
okay.
button because I heard my grandson in the background playing, which is part of the new norm. So I didn't want that background noise. The balance between embracing diversity and equity, inclusion, and I actually add belonging as well, without succumbing to our personal biases. Really, I kind of go back to my role on this committee at Penn State, where we're looking to not only recruit more people, more non-whites, as well as retain them. Another part of that role is how we can really focus on removing some of those biases as it pertains to, one, that internal bias. We tend to find ourselves leaning towards internal candidates that's worked within the institution, and the argument is they have an institutional knowledge. Of course they do, they work here, but that does not mean that someone coming from the outside does not necessarily have that institutional knowledge, including myself. I wouldn't be here if we exclusively focused on that, but that tends to be our preference, is saying they know the institution. Or we lean towards someone who's graduated from the institution, and we're really enamored from the cover letter with regards to their affinity for the institution and sharing common and shared experiences for the institution. And do we want to use that as part of the judgment to sway us towards offering that candidate an interview? Then on top of that, the other bias, which is a little bit more evident, but kind of covertly not discussed as much, as our scrutiny of the degrees and the institutions to which the candidates bring to the table. This institution and their degree isn't seen as prominently, respectfully, as this institution and their degree. Sometimes we even go as far as to say how long ago they earned that degree, or the relevance of that degree, especially if it's been many years ago towards the institution and its approach, without looking at the entire and whole picture of the candidate. So we're trying to remove those types of biases. The institution that they worked at prior and how they're now looking to come to our institution. We want to do as much as we can to eliminate that. And it's not as simple as you might think, because some of it is just our internal biases, but we do want to speak to and judge those things by trying to remove them as much as possible. So I think that that's probably the best example that I'm dealing with currently. I'll stop there.
Yeah. Emily, any from your research, any connections between the DEI topics and professionalism, and are you seeing anything emerge there?
Yeah, I think a lot of that lends to educating employers. I think that's where the focus shifts to. Most industries have a lot of work to do. I know institutions of higher education can be more progressive than other industries that you see, but still a lot of work to do within. So I think if you can engage with employers and talk about how culture and identity play a big role in how candidates are going to connect with you, and to what Megan has said many times, you have to be clear as an employer about what your expectations are, and really look at yourselves and be mindful of what kind of environment you're setting up for diverse candidates, populations to show up at work and feel safe and feel included and feel valued, and look at the standards of professionalism that you have. Again, look around you, who's on the leadership team, who is coming up with these definitions. Who are they creating barriers for potentially? Are they creating barriers? And, you know, what policies, programs, practices can you reformulate to promote equity and inclusion in the office, to mitigate biases? yeah, I think that's where, again, if you have a career services office or you face the community, or work in workforce development, whatever, you have an opportunity to learn for yourself or to educate others who are in employing positions. They may not work in HR or whatever, but they're in employing positions. They have positions of power. And yeah, really think about what practices do you have that are creating barriers and for whom.
Also, I'm going to come back to that thought in one minute here, Megan. To our audience, if you have questions, please use the chat box where we are winding down a little bit on time. I apologize for that, but if there's anything burning you want to ask our panelists, please feel free to do so. Emily, you mentioned a strategy earlier that I thought was, and I'm sure, I hope that we all practice this, and that is the idea of having multiple eyes look at something from multiple perspectives. So you raise the example of, the faculty member or the recommendation that when you go into an interview, you stand up and you greet the person, like here are some behaviors. But when you had other eyes look at it, they said, well, that may not always apply. I think that expansion of perspective is so important. So it doesn't represent my view of the world or your view of the world, that we come together and we push back politely, gently, but firmly, right, Megan, and say, this is something we need to reconsider. I love that as an approach, and I've always seen it only make things better. Clayton and Megan, let me come to you. Are there other strategies that you found really effective in terms of improving the professional perspective within your institutions?
Well, one thing I might offer is just a change of frame, and that is not just to professionalism, but I think it's to a lot of the work that we do, which is thinking about our institutions, ourselves, our students, using an asset-based approach as opposed to a deficit-based approach, right? Mm-hmm. Some of what we're talking about here is we're thinking like, what do people not have? How do they not fit into, right, some standard that's come from before, right? And that's a deficit-based approach, right? Think about an asset-based approach. We think about two different types of things. One, we think about maybe it's not the person, it's the institution, right? It's the institution that might not be ready to accommodate every person, right? Especially our students, as opposed to that student not being ready, right, for the institution. And the other way that we can think about it is that people, right, who might not fit a perfect mold, they bring assets, they bring experience that might not already exist at that institution. And kind of to Clayton's point, that can be a huge benefit, right? So that might bring to a marketing department the idea that there are untapped markets that the institution hasn't identified, because if everyone in the marketing department is, really comes from the same viewpoint, then they're not going to be looking, right, for differentiated markets. So really trying to think about, as opposed to this person is different and that differentiation is a negative, right? That having attached, whatever it is, that's a negative, right? As opposed to, listen, that brings a positive, right, for that person's perspective, because that's a perspective don't already have here. And we want perspective because that is going to help us meet our mission, right? Institution.
Yeah, thank you,
We
Megan.
just asked two simple questions in addition to why the person is being excluded. The first question is, what doesn't this candidate meet? What's missing? And what do they need to get it? And the person to whom is indicating what's missing now it takes on the added responsibility of saying, what does that person need? And how they could go about getting it at our institution. And you find a lot of times the conversation really kind of shifts towards, well, the person will learn this over time, or the person has access to this. And they start to really rethink whether or not their rationale for eliminating that person really makes sense and is really giving that person fair consideration. I liken it back to what Emily mentioned earlier about the person's inability to shake a person's hand due to either their religious beliefs or standing up and shake their hand in a wheelchair. And you liken that to saying they didn't demonstrate professionalism. Well, if you ask those questions, then you get to what Emily was referring to. So I think that's what we've started doing. Still more to come, but that's what we've started working on.
Wow. Hey, I got to tell you, this has been just, I hope for you as well, but it's just a fascinating conversation. It seems to me like there are so many other avenues to unpack here and explore. I want to thank each of you for taking the time today to be with us and to share your insights. Just a lot there to work with and to work on. So thank you so much for that. I want to go back to Doug Gray and ask Doug if there's anything you would like to share about upcoming programs. And I know you're going to mention MOLLI 2023, right?
Yes, indeed. I'd like to thank everyone for coming today. This has been a great webinar. We will be doing another webinar coming in the spring. We'll probably be putting out more information about that in about a month. But also I will, for those of you who aren't MOLLI alums, we will be holding our key presentation in June of 2023, which is a 4-day leadership institute. And it is designed, focused on leadership in higher education, in particular, online learning leadership. So we will be putting out information on that starting in November. It is probably the, I would say, the least expensive leadership training program that you can get in on. And I will tell you that folks, you know, it was great to see folks from 2017 and onward who have attended previous versions. And Larry is the curricular designer. We have redesigned the program every year for the past 5 years. And we're going to be doing it again. So look for more information on that program. So thank you all for coming. Larry?
Yeah, thank you. Folks, I want to challenge you as I felt challenged today to use this information, thinking about how we represent ourselves as professionals and how we can help those that we may influence. I'd say both up and down. And I think about the real challenge of probably managing up and influencing how we think about creating a more open and diverse, equitable and inclusive environment in considering the professional angle and the lens that we share. So thank you all again to my speakers. You're just terrific. Thank you so much. And we'll see you in the springtime. And please, if you haven't participated in MOLLI yet, consider joining us for the 2023 program. Take care all. Bye-bye.